welcome to the first interview of the Building With series. It's a series that focuses on architecture and historic preservation. This one will focus on building with opportunity, the lady that we have with us today is Karen McKinney. The way the format will be is that we will have a 30-minute interview series, and then we will open the floor for questions. There is also cubes on each of the tables with more information that Karen has presented for us. Karen McKinney is an architect, and she works as a grant manager for the Louisiana State Historic Preservation Office, and we're gonna get started now. So Karen, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What led you to studying history, historic preservation, to work with the Louisiana State Historic Preservation Office?
Okay, if at any point you're not hearing me, let me know. I'll try to. My coordination with the microphone is not always great. So I apologize in advance for that. Also, if at any point you have anybody has a question, just raise your hand. I'm adjunct instructor for 12 years in counting, so I'm used to being interrupted periodically, and so feel free. So I'm from Washington, Louisiana, so part of St. Andrew Parish here. Grew up in the area, actually next door to my grandparents' house, which is where I live now. Historic home, family's been in St. Andrew Parish since the 1720s on one side and the 1800 on the other. So long time, a lot of history in the family here. I live in the home in Washington that was built by the steamboat captains of my family in early 1800s. So my interest in both architecture and history has been lifelong. So I've always been interested in old buildings, always been interested in history. I worked with my grandfather in the 1970s when they first started planning I-49 going through town. There were a lot of studies done. There's a group that came together to start putting together the historic district that's now in Washington. Part of that was going in and doing historic building survey documentation of several of the buildings in town. Our home was one of those, and through that, there was someone working with my grandfather to I keep wanting to say digitized, but at that point it was microfilm. The family records that were in the house that were from the steamboat era and earlier. So I sat with my grandfather making lists of documents that got sent out to be photographed for the microfilm records that are now part of two collections in the state archives and state library system. So that from very early, I was fascinated by what was on these old bills of lading and the steamboat record books talking about what was on the boats and who was traveling on them and how long it took the trip and where they went, because they went from Washington through the Chapalama Basin, up the Mississippi River, all the way up to Ohio, traveling back and forth. And so just seeing the different boats and what was on them, I just found fascinating. So kind of the combination of architecture and history has been a lifelong thing for me. I also moved away after college at UL, had my Bachelor of Architecture, moved to Central Florida, was there for 8 years, but came back home eventually. We all came back home here. Especially when you have as many relatives in the area. So came back home. My husband and I met in college. Been to each other for 8.5 years. We met each other out back in Lafayette on New Year's Eve one time, and have been together for 27 years since. We moved into my grandfather's house after he passed away in 1998. When I moved back into town, having been away and worked on things somewhere else and understanding codes and zoning and historic district information that I worked on in Florida, I brought back home and had a very memorable discussion with one Washington Town Council member who told me, well, if you want to change things, maybe you should go back to Florida, which just made me mad. Then start talking to more people. We did eventually, it took us almost 10 years of working to get an actual historic district ordinance passed to form a historic district commission, but that is active and working in Washington now. And because I worked with that ordinance getting it passed, I ended up the town council, kind of like, small towns, if you're familiar with it, once you're on their phone list, they just keep calling. So I ended up writing ordinances for billboards, for mobile homes. They called me to write something about horses, and I was like, I know nothing about horses. I can't write words about them. So it's just kind of the continuing interest in different things. I started teaching at UL Lafayette as an adjunct. I was at a reception with my husband, who's a full-time faculty member there. On a Thursday evening, they were looking for someone to cover a course. Classes started on Monday. At 6 o'clock in the evening, they were like, well, class probably won't make, but just in case, would you cover it? And I said, yes. And by 10 o'clock that night, the class was full of students, and I had to start work on Monday teaching very suddenly. I kind of taught whatever courses they needed me to cover during the time that I had been there. From first year studio, first year drawing courses, through working with graduate students on codes, for building codes, reviews for their projects, and just kind of whatever other courses they need me to cover in between. And so it's kind of been a mixed bag. I didn't know I was going to go ahead of time that I was going to be covering as an adjunct. But I loved working with the students and loved working with community groups, so I'm really happy to be here today working with all of you. The other part of what I ended up doing as an adjunct was working with another faculty member who is a full-time faculty member on grants from the State Division of Historic Preservation, doing Historic American Building Survey documentation, teaching students as a course and taking them out to a site, doing extensive measurements of the building, photographs of the building and the site, and then generating measure drawings of that, which then get submitted into the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. So those are now permanent records of those buildings. We did that together for 8 years. And I learned about the grant process. So at the age of 50, when my husband and I both decided to go back to college, I completed a graduate certificate in historic preservation. And when I finished that, I was like, well, halfway to a degree, why wouldn't I just go ahead and finish? What else can I do here? So I ended up doing a Master of History in Public History, which when I read the description of what public historians do, I was like, this is exactly what I want to be doing. This is great. I'll just keep doing this, Some of which I wish that I had some of the information when I was doing a lot of the early community work that I was doing. It would have been great to have more of that information that I've learned from some of the courses I took in grad school. So that's kind of the roundabout way of how I ended up where I am now. 60 years old now, so I have a time to try a lot of different stuff, go through different things. And that's kind of where I am today. As an adjunct, I can't, with my mixed degrees, academia doesn't like when you do two different things between bachelor's and master's degrees. They want everything to be the same. So I can only stay as an adjunct, which if you've ever adjuncted, that doesn't do very well. So I started looking for what else I could do. I ended up applying at the State Division of Historic Preservation. relocation. They were looking for tax credit review. That's what I was hired as and what I started off doing, but they really needed a grants manager and ended up going into that position 3 months after I started there. And that's what I've been doing for the last, this month will be 2 years.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. I heard you mention something called an historic district ordinance. What goes into that and what does it protect?
So once you have a historic district in place, so the first step is working with the National Register of Historic Places program to put together an application to create a historic district. Once you have that historic district, all the district does is says this is a significantly historic place with significant buildings in it in this specific geographic area. Once you have that in place, then the local jurisdiction would pass that ordinance, which would set up how you regulate what happens in that space. And it's different in each jurisdiction. The National Register will provide, or we can provide you copies of how they say there's a model ordinance that you start off with, but you make that work for your area. So it can be as restrictive as what they have, like in the Vieux Carré, the French Quarter in New Orleans, which goes down to they have to research the colors and the types of paint on the buildings to match everything exactly. They have to use historic bricks to salvage materials to be able to reproduce things if they do repairs on a building, or it can be a little looser and not be as restrictive. And you look at what are the most significant things and the most important about your district, in your community, that you want to protect. In Washington, as the chair of the Historic District Commission, I have stated numerous times, I don't care what color they paint the building. Paint is cheap and easy to fix, as long as they don't paint over historic brick that has never been painted before, because you can't get the paint off once you paint the brick. Other than that, I don't care what color they paint the buildings, because paint changes over time, and you have to be able to live with your own home, especially if it's your home. Businesses are a little different, but if it's your home, I'm not going to tell you have to paint it yellow because 200 years ago it was yellow. If you hate yellow, but
what qualifies a building or a place to be labeled as historic? Like, is there like an age that it has to be, or like, what makes it quote unquote special?
in that there are different areas of significance. The most common is for architecture, and most buildings need to be at least 50 years old in the state of Louisiana to be considered historic. However, things can be listed on the National Register of Historic Places for multiple things that are significant. So there could be a very significant event that happened at that building that affected a lot of people, whether it's on a local, a state, or a national level. And that would make that location significant, even if it wasn't yet 50 years old. It could be because there was a person there that was very significant, very important, that affected the local, state, or national level to have something listed on the National Register. Sometimes there are objects, there are things related to like the logging industry, so a certain piece of equipment that ran on the railroad that was what they used to use to be able to harvest timber during the heavy timber boom in the 1800s. It just depends on what the individual thing is. Like I said, the most common is usually what people recognize as water architecture, so a very significant building that has a particular style, that is a high style of that building that's in really good condition and been kept up over time, would be the most common. The other category is for sites, so something like a cemetery, a battlefield, or other underground remains of something that locates something significant that happens there or happened in the history of the area. Does that come? That's like a very short version of what, there's a whole lot of information, but yes.
Then if you have a collection in a close proximity, then you have a district.
Yes.
But you can have
So-
a single registered historic.
So you can have an individual listing, which would be a single property, and it's what's on that individual property. So it may be a single building if it's one building, or if there are multiple buildings on the same property, they're all identified when you do the survey for the application. Some may be considered significant for the I saw you get the shoe.
Wow. Don't go over.
It won't hurt us if we don't hurt it.
We just stay calm.
I'll be right back. Okay, so there's individual listings, so one property. There's also a district, which means that all the properties have to be contiguous, so there has to be a continuous connection between the properties. The third thing is a multiple property listing. So if you're in a certain area and the buildings are not necessarily a contiguous property for a district, but there is an otherwise connection between them. And that was sometimes a little harder to define. But for example, in the state of Ohio, they have a multiple property listing for historic barns of a certain type. So they're scattered all over the state, but they went through and identified, I think there was something like 150 something roughly of a particular style and form of barns all over the state that are a multiple property for historic barns of Ohio. So if there is some kind of a connection like that, it could be sites. I think in Louisiana we have a multiple property listing for A. Hayes Town's architecture. So things can be added to that periodically. If people want to include their building, they can do an application. Once the difference with the multiple property listing is it identifies certain buildings to start with, and it gives the characteristics of those buildings that make them qualify for that listing. Once you have that in place, if others want to be added to that, the basic historic information data is already determined, so it makes it a little shorter process to add buildings to that listing if you can show proof that there's a connection. So that's kind of the three main things related to the national registry. I think George had a question.
Might be too soon to ask, but the foundation of a historic business, if it's remaining in a building, do you think that would be a decent location?
It depends on what makes it significant. Why is that?
Largest cereal mill in the world.
So that might be something that would qualify. But it would take putting together the first step in the National Register process is an eligibility questionnaire.
Okay.
So there you're putting together, it's a very short, in most cases, it's a short history that says, okay, this is why you think this might be significant, before you do like the very extensive, very long and involved full application for a National Register listing.
So you said you made a district in Washington. I assume there's more than 3 buildings on it. So like, is it a residential area?
It's a good portion of the town.
So like, I guess like part of it is you have to go and ask all the people who own these like buildings and these houses, like, I guess what I'm asking is like, once they get put on the register and like everything's said and done, do they really get a lot of leeway in how they get to change their houses or their buildings or whatever?
So just forming the district doesn't put any kind of restrictions or anything on anyone. All it does is say, we're saying this is historic. And every building within the geographic area gets identified on the survey, and they're determined to be either contributing if they're part of the significance of the area, or non-contributing. So if there's a trailer, or if there's something that was just built last year, those would be identified as non-contributing, which affects things a little in different programs later on. Every property owner gets notification, but they're basically getting a notice saying, this property has been identified as part of this district. And they have the opportunity to go to the state meeting in Baton Rouge, that's the review board that reviews the application, to make comments. They can say they're in favor or against. Most places today have, people are a little more aware of the benefits as opposed to the drawbacks. Anything that tells you what you can do with your building comes when the local jurisdiction passes an ordinance saying this is what you can and can't do. But that wouldn't happen until the local area decides how they're going to administer their district. Just making the district doesn't put any restrictions on properties. What it does do is make those that are considered contributing eligible for the tax credit incentive program if they are income producing when the project is completed. So if they do work in the building, it's usually for businesses because it has to be income producing. Once the project's completed, you turn in the information on the expenditures, and you can get a percentage of that back in credits on whatever you owe on taxes, whether it's state or federal or both. You can actually do both programs. For this area, the state legislature a year and a half ago passed an amendment to the ordinance which says that they proclaimed a higher tax credit percentage for rural areas, so you all would be part of that rural area, which gives a 35% tax credit. Adding that to the federal tax credit, which is 20%, so that's over half of your rehabilitation costs. Now, the work has to be done in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. So there is a restriction on how that money is applied on the building. It has to still look like a historic building, the historic building that was there when you started, just in better condition than previous.
Suppose you have a building that's already been added on to the rest of the building, but it's pretty.
As long as it has to be listed on the National Register or part of a district as a contributing resource for the federal. For the state, it has the same requirement, or it can be part of a cultural district or a downtown development district. So the state added a little more leeway for the state side. Just because there's been things done to the building over time, as long as it retains its historic integrity, the things that made it significant when it was listed on the National Register or identified as historic. That's the big thing with the tax credit program, is we're maintaining historic buildings, so it still has to look historic when it's done. Yeah, so if even though there were some additions over time, as long as it's not, hasn't taken away too much from the historic part of it.
Are there grants for individuals that use?
Yeah, so there are no grants for individual buildings. We don't do any construction of buildings through the tax credit program, and that's only for income producing properties. Now, if you have something that's a bed and breakfast or a guest house, or as long as it's income producing, then it could qualify for the tax credit program.
As of now, Arnaudvill is a cultural district, so your house would qualify.
Agriculture.
For the state credits. Yeah. If there was also a district, then you could do state and federal. I think Great Coteau is the only one of the 3 communities that has a historic district currently. It's a pretty small district.
This was kind of dumb, but I'm still gonna ask it. You said that the French Quarter has like really severe restrictions placed on it, whereas like you have to actually use historical materials to fix buildings. Where do they find the materials for that?
From other parts of the city, or it's being done on different buildings. And sometimes it's best that they can find for matching things. It just depends on what it is. You can also reproduce, so if it's a wood component, you can reproduce the wood components. Doors and windows can be reproduced, so they look like they're historic. We kind of like jumped way over.
So for those of us who don't or aren't familiar with the Louisiana Historic Preservation Office, can you tell us a little bit more about it? For instance, is it state run? Where is it located? Things like that.
So the State Historic Preservation Office is 2 divisions under the Louisiana Department of Cultural Recreation and Tourism. And we are under the Office of Cultural Development, which also includes like the arts and Coteau programs. So the Historic Preservation Office is the Division of Historic Preservation and the Division of Archaeology. Obviously, the Archaeology Division takes care of underground resources, and Historic Preservation handles everything above ground. The Historic Preservation Office has the Historic Preservation Fund grant program. There's also historic standing structure surveys, the National Register of Historic Places, Certified Local Government program, the Main Street program, the Tax Incentives program, and then Section 106 reviews. So this is like, for the most part, other than the tax credit incentives, there's like one person doing each of these, handling each of these programs. Standing structures surveys are part of what is done when there is either a Section 106 review, and I'll explain what that program is, or if you're doing a National Register project, you're going to be doing a standing structure survey, or we call it a Louisiana Historic Resource Inventory form, which is the form you complete. It has a brief history of each building, and then some photographs of it that identify them, and that goes in as part of the district application if you're applying for a National Register listing. The Section 106 reviews are something that in general people don't necessarily hear about very much unless you're doing a project that is related to federal funds, properties, or agencies. So if those 3 things are involved in a project in any way, then it requires a Section 106 review to determine whether historic resources are going to be affected by the proposed project. So that's kind of like what happens. Sometimes that's when resources are discovered because they're going in and looking for something in a place that hasn't been anything surveyed before. Sometimes it's a new road or highway that's requiring work to be done somewhere, and they have to find out what's there before and how it's going to be affected before they do that work or complete that project. We talked about National Register. The certified local government program is also one your community could look into. So this is kind of sets up a guideline and have with the local the local political representation. So would set up your certified local government. So certain things would have to be in place. So if there's a historic district, you would need your historic district commission to be doing what they are supposed to be doing, like following what the ordinance says, reviewing applications, reviewing any challenges to the results, have the jurisdiction, working with people on projects. There's kind of a list of things to go through for certified local government, but it opens up additional funding and an additional part of the historic preservation grant funding program as to a community. So it would go for community projects. So this is not for sometimes it's for a single building. If there's one, I think we currently have a grant with the certified local government that is a single, very large building that's been vacant for 10 years, and they have a historic district which butts up against the property but doesn't include that property. They'd like to add it to the district, but they want to figure out what are they going to do with it. How can they use that to enhance their district? What kind of programs would be supported happening there? So they're doing an extensive feasibility study to try to help figure out what can we do with this building. They're working with consultants to come in and interview people, set up meetings, having a lot of community meetings to figure that out. Because it's a community-wide project, sometimes certified local government, if they already have a district, they can do a grant funding to go back if their district, like ours in Washington, was done in the 1970s. It's been over 50 years. Some of the buildings are not there anymore. There are new things that weren't there previously. The whole district needs to be recertified. If Washington is a certified local government, I think they're trying to work on that. They could get funding to hire consultants to come in and actually resurvey the entire district and make recommendations for any changes that would need to occur to that. So that's a community-wide program. The Main Street program comes in after we have certified local government. That's one that works kind of independently from the federal programs that we work directly with, but it works with communities for specific programs, some of which are building construction improvements for communities that the community is funding, and so it helps to pay for those projects. We've already talked a little bit about the tax credits and those programs. Any questions about the different programs? It's a very brief description of those.
Can
Yes.
we talk about Main Street? So that's for smaller towns to be able to revitalize in a way, especially maybe it doesn't have to have a historic Main Street downtown, because we see a lot of those are dying. I'm assuming this is in response to sort of a little bit of a Main Street collapse. And so does it have to be kind of centralized in the Main Street, or can it kind of be anywhere in a smaller town? The funding is applied.
There has to be an identified area.
Okay.
That's what you're including as part of that program.
Is there a minimum building size requirement for historic building?
No, there's no restrictions on how big or small something has to be listed. There are individual listings for things as small as an outhouse or bell tower on a church. Things as large as whole cities or areas, developments.
So a part of a building would be considered historic and the rest of it, okay.
Now the whole building would be listed, but only the work on the historic part is eligible for the tax credit program. So you can't use the tax credits to add on to or to change the significant historic characteristics of the building. Have to be retained. Any other questions?
So you've talked a little bit about the opportunities that exist already. Are there any other opportunities that you want to highlight that for communities who are looking to preserve land or structures?
So the one part of this that I didn't talk about is actually my job, what I do, the Historic Preservation Fund grant program. So a community could apply for a grant to hire a consultant to do the work to become a certified local government. A community could apply for that, or a nonprofit could apply for grant funding to put together the documentation for a National Register district application. Those are eligible expenditures for Historic Preservation Fund grants. The grant program is funding from the Department of the Interior through the National Park Service from the federal level that is awarded to the State Division of Historic Preservation, which is in Baton Rouge. And then we in turn use a portion of those funds, which pays for staff salaries, and a portion of those funds goes out as sub-grants to communities and nonprofits throughout the state who apply for those grant funds on an annual basis. Right now, we are not sure. There's not a federal budget at present. I strongly urge you to let your federal elected officials know your opinions, what you think is important in the budget, because that seems good. At question, we're not sure what's going to happen in the future with that fund. Hopefully, it will continue. These grants have been critical for historic preservation in all ways that affect communities all across the country. Because the funds come from the federal government, the National Park Service sets what is considered eligible expenses under these grants. So I think one of the sides of the cube, I have kind of a list of some of the types of projects that would qualify for grant funding. So I mentioned putting together a National Register nomination, or putting together an application for a certified local government program, feasibility studies on historic buildings, things like this community education plan with a series of information sessions that are put together. It's kind of a mixed bag, a wide range of different kinds of things. And I have a 25-page chapter 6 of the Historic Preservation Fund manual, which explains what all the different things that are eligible expenses under this program. But anything related to the National Register pretty much comes through as something that would be an eligible project or eligible expense. Applications for the 25-26 grant session are open right now at the state level on our website. So you could go there and look at the information that's required, the applications through submittables. So usually it's a nonprofit or jurisdictions who have a submittable account. Okay. To look at if you have an interested project, or let me know, send me an email, and we can look at what you have and see if it's a project, and if it's not directly, we can see if there is a part of it that might be eligible, or how to revise it that might help with your community. Okay.
So how do you feel preserving important historic and cultural assets contributes to a community's sense of well-being and sense of cultural identity.
So I kind of sat down next to all the notes because I was like, I can't even not say something. Okay, that's real pretty. So we all take for granted what's around us until it disappears. And it's really unfortunate that sometimes the biggest spur to action results after there's a major loss. We don't realize how big a hole that building that gets torn down leaves until it's gone. And then we realize, what have we lost? And what if we lose more? And then all of a sudden, there's a call to action. People want to preserve what's there. That's the whole sense of place, of community. It's part of our identity as individuals, as communities, what makes us who we are. So we need those physical spaces to contain the memories, individual and community pride, that make us who we are. Every building is not the most significant. Sometimes the ones that you miss the most, though, are the ones that you take advantage of every day. You think they're always going to be there until something happens and they're gone, right? Or they are damaged. So the National Park Service defines, the significance of historic preservation as places that define where we've been and who we are, and help to educate us for the future. And that's probably the best way of identifying that sense of community and that sense of loss that happens if something is gone. On the other hand, it can take a single owner taking a building that's been sitting vacant in a downtown and restoring it and opening a new business there, or rejuvenating an older business there, and all of a sudden people notice things and things start to change, and an entire downtown can get reworked and come alive after that one person makes a difference and makes a change. So we want to try to go for that helps to keep that sense of community. Doesn't mean things can't change, but it means that we need to keep that sense of identity that's contained in the physical locations around us. As an architect and a historian combined, I have kind of a mixed viewpoint. In addition to that, with the research I've done, there's a second part of that that's been overlooked for a long time. Studying the buildings that have survived the test of time can also inform us about what we need to build in the future. People survived for centuries without electricity and oil and gas. We need to look back at how things were built, how people survived in buildings for all this time without the things that are now it's already happening, but accelerating climate change. We need to try to incorporate the things that can help to sustainably build for the future, and not by any means telling anyone to go without electricity or to not have air conditioning in South Louisiana in the summertime. But how things were done in the past. So, flood control, don't build things on a slab in an area that's historically flooded. Just elevate the buildings. The things that have survived are the things that have been elevated above the floodplain. We need to just make sure that we're doing that, what needs to happen. The methods of construction, like mortise and tenon out of cypress, that when it gets wet, it actually forms a tighter joint holding the buildings together, as opposed to nails which pop out and the building comes apart. So planting trees in the right orientation so that you have shade in the summertime, in the hot months, and putting porches on the side that's in the sun so you have shade. And a cool place to sit in the heat of the summertime. And then enough windows and doors so that you can see inside without having to turn the lights on. If you have a beautiful, bright, sunny day in the middle of the summertime, you shouldn't need to turn on the lights inside of buildings, especially significant in homes. And having those windows operable with screens on them so that you can open the windows on a really nice day when you don't need air conditioning and just let air move through the buildings. In areas subject to excessive storm winds and potential flooding conditions, not using materials that deteriorate in the wet. When things were along the coast were all wood, the water would come in, everything floats around and gets wet, and then the water goes away and the whole building dries out and people clean it up and go on by. That has sheetrock and carpeting, you can't do that. You have to tear everything apart and start over and rebuild everything. So just having those things in mind and looking at what has historically survived and helped people to survive to help reduce those things that are causing the issues that we're having now, that we're dealing with.
You talked a bit about buildings that have withstood the test of time and its relation to the nature around it. Could you tell us a little bit about how live oaks do that in certain areas of Louisiana?
And so I worked on my master's thesis in public history, was writing a multiple property National Register listing on Grand Isle. That's our only occupied coastal barrier island in Louisiana. I thought it was funny when I first called the State Historic Preservation Office about doing that, and the National Register coordinator at the time was stunned and said, "There are historic buildings on Grand Isle." Where? Because nobody seemed to realize they were there. There are buildings that have been there since the mid-1800s and have survived and are still there. Believe it or not, I know hurricanes every 7 years annually on an average, with storm surges between 6 and 12 feet happening, and there are buildings still there. There are buildings that are all wood construction. There are buildings that are in the row of live oaks that are in the middle of the island that help to break up the tide and block the winds and hold the buildings in place. So instead of the tidal surge coming in and washing the buildings away, they're between the trees, and so the trees help to hold the buildings in place. I think Grand Isle, about 4 years ago now, actually passed an ordinance to prevent people from cutting down any of the live oaks on the island, because they have recognized that the trees hold the soil in place and keep the areas around them secure, so it's harder for things to wash away. It's an integral part of their community. So more than what we look at as it's a beautiful tree and it's providing shade in the summertime and shelter for wildlife, and outdoor events, they're also forming a very practical purpose of actually holding soil in place and keeping what's necessary there for life around them.
Yeah, it's lovely. Thank you for explaining that. I think lastly, you mentioned spending some time studying abroad in Costa Rica. Could you talk about how historic preservation differs amongst cultures?
I did a study abroad course in Costa Rica as a student and thought it was funny that my teacher was 30 years younger than me at the time. Only two of my instructors in my graduate certificate and my master's degree program were younger than me. But I did a study abroad. It was in May of the year. They do a 10-day trip. It's extremely intensive. We're constantly moving from one location to the next every day. But we did a day trip to a native community called the Bree, which is in extreme South Costa Rica, about 5 miles from the Panama border. And I've seen recreations of native people's building with different kinds of materials in a few different places where that was done. And it always seemed kind of to be disintegrating quickly, falling apart, not always well put together. What we saw at the Bree community was amazingly, beautifully constructed buildings. And they explained that for them, historic preservation is not about the building that's there now. Historic preservation is about passing on the method of building the community buildings. And so there is a part of the tribe which identifies the ideal astrological time of the year when they decide that it's time to build a new building. And there is a group of the tribe that goes out in the area around and identifies the materials to harvest to build the building with. And there's another group that actually does the harvesting, and so on. Each different part, there's one part of the tribe that's what they do. And then once they start constructing the building, there are parts of the community that are responsible for each different part. The men build the heavier structure of the building, and the women do all of the weaving of the grasses that form the roof. And it's like a basket. It's a beautiful, detailed basket and work of art. And the children collect sticks and twigs to make the railings which go around the structure, because where they are is very low water table, and they're subject to flooding on a regular basis. So the whole structure is elevated about 6 feet above the ground level. So, but just the whole concept of that, it is a community knowledge, which is the historic preservation, as opposed to the structure itself. They know the structure is not going to last longer than about 30 to 35 years. And depending on how severe the flooding is, it could be less than that. But they know how to rebuild it, and so they just rebuild it as they need to, instead of trying to keep what's already there.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Now I'm going to open the floor to any more questions, if anyone has any.
Who do you know who is passing on knowledge like that with traditional, regional building techniques? Do you know anyone?
I don't know directly off the top of my head. I know that the Louisiana Architecture Foundation recently did a film called Ancestral Artistry.
Yeah.
And I would urge you to see that if you haven't seen that, if you don't have an opportunity to see that. That was a past grant recipient. They had grants for 2 years for phase 1 and phase 2 to help fund the making of that film. far as I know, that's the only group that I know of that is doing that type of thing.
Do you think we're moving away from, say, like traditional Louisiana architecture, like in regional spaces, more towards, I don't know, cookie cutter, like kind of architecture, like everything I don't know. For me, I feel like everything looks the same now. Like I never look and see anything that has any kind of character whatsoever.
There's the professor that I did the house course with, and I have a running disagreement on what vernacular architecture is. So vernacular is historically that which is the most likely there to be constructed based on the local knowledge, materials, and then climate and topography. So how are you going to build with what you have to live in the way that you are, to be able to survive in that climate? So historically here, that's been what we look at as like an Acadian cottage or a Cajun cottage, wood frame construction with a steeply pitched roof, porches or overhangs on the buildings, large windows for ventilation, usually elevated up off of the ground to get out of the wet winds. He likes to say that it's the most likely thing to be built, so he tries to say that Walmart big boxes are, vernacular because they're all over the place and they're being built, but those are not vernacular. There's another movement in architecture called critical regionalism, and so what this does is what I outlined as taking from historic buildings before. So taking that historic building information and using materials and methods available today and building a building combining the two. So you will have steel construction, or you will have glue laminated beams, or more extensive modern materials, but taking lessons from what has survived in that area in the past. And so it's going to be very different here than it would be in Washington State, than it would be in Maine, than it would be in Chicago, because we're all very different climate-wise, and depending on the site you're on, if it's something that's on high ground or low ground, whether you're subject to winds or tides or snow loads, just depends on what needs to be there for the building and the people using it to survive. So that's taking roughly what I discussed with that lesson from the start.
What's the term again?
Critical regionalism.
Would St. Matthew Parish Tourist Commission be an example of that type of construction?
What's done at NUNU, the intersection at NUNU is along those lines. Yeah, where you get overhangs, and it's a little low to the ground. They could go a little higher up. They floated a few times. Yeah, it's a little low, but roughly, yes, that type of structure where you are taking the historic and combining it with the modern to create something that hopefully survives. Even though they've had flooding, they haven't had serious issues, from my understanding, because the water is actually draining out and it's all drying out because they used historic wood deck for the floor, and the cabinets and the countertops are concrete, so everything survives the floods when it does go in.
I have a second question. So in regards to community identity and the way it connects to historic structures, is it incumbent upon the people who renovate or develop those properties to honor the history of those structures? For example, plantation homes. I mean, a lot of times we'll see that there's renovations that occur, and then the story of how they were constructed or becomes part of the bigger story? Is that part of the?
In the case of plantations, it depends on if it's open to the public, then they need to tell the whole story. That's just my opinion. The whole story needs to be told. If it's a private home,
Right.
it's your home,
It's your
so
home, but-
yeah, you're living in it. I would hope that the whole story is there and available. Sometimes there's not really a lot of documentation, or you have to go looking for it to find it.
So do you have a list of maybe of architects and builders who are like specializing in this critical regionalism? Because that's something that we're looking to do in the area. Like create the buildings with the overhangs and the porches and all of that.
You can search online for just typing critical regionalism and Louisiana, and you will probably find quite a few firms that, even though they don't necessarily identify themselves as like critical regionalism designers, they are using that information or using that technique in the building that they're doing on some projects. I know a handful of firms, but as a state employee, I can't recommend anyone. There is a list on our website of firms and consulting organizations, and it identifies what they are, what they do, the kind of work they do, who have requested being listed on our website for people to search and contact for historic preservation.
And they use that term in their specialties in critical regionalism.
Some do and some don't. I know, it's just a little,
Comment. I think the struggle that we face in America today is the wood that was available back when. I've experienced with a lot of old cypress cabins and cypress homes, and the wood back then was just one. Trees were much larger than the size of these tables, old growth wood, the frame was really tight. It was really strong, really weather resistant. The wood we get nowadays, the rain is almost a quarter inch apart. It rots in a couple of years. It's not the same wood. Even though it's still cypress, it's just not that old growth cypress. We were blessed in this area to have a lot of old growth cypress. Unfortunately, it was all cut down to make all these well-built homes.
I like showing students the historic map of New Orleans when it was only the area that was the French Quarter, and you see kind of the views that were drawn of it at the time, and it's like there's a huge river, it's a little tiny area of buildings, and then there's just trees as far as the eye can see all around the river, and I was like, see, that's what built New Orleans. All those trees are not there anymore. Now they're buildings instead.
There's still a couple of old growth cypress trees around. They're finding more and more just in the middle of nowhere. It'd be really nice to see some of the really old trees around. A sequoia, not a small scale, but still much more.
The other thing I point out to students is when we're looking at old sketches of some of the plantations when they were initially constructed in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there are these things that show up that are like these sticks coming up with like these puffballs of leaves on top. So those were the live oaks 200 years ago. So what we plant now in 200 years will be the old growth trees of the future, whether they are cypress or live oaks or magnolias or pecans, whatever we plant now, those are the future ones. So we also need to plant trees.
That's why a lot of people build with sheetrock and other materials because wood is just not
like building materials. Most of the buildings were done with wood and brick. If you're doing interiors, you're looking at what's in coastal areas, they used wood only, so wood tongue roof on the interiors and wood siding on the outside. Now, none of them, the older ones, they don't have insulation on the walls either, so we get very chilly in the wintertime. And you probably wouldn't have very efficient air conditioning if we were running it in the summertime because there's no insulation on the walls. So you kind of have to figure out what the balance is going to be. To be comfortable in the building and have it survive for what you want it to do. And there's not just one answer. There are a lot of new products coming out. There are a lot of things being built now and it's a growing industry, very small. There are recycled plastics being made into cement block size blocks that are being used as interior finished materials. So it's just figuring out what's going to be the thing that works for you. Anyone else?
Thank you so much for joining us today, Karen. We really appreciate all of the knowledge you shared with us. If no one else has any other questions, I just want to thank y'all for coming today. The next interview series is on Saturday, June 21st with Professor Jeff Jertson from the UL Building Institute. He'll be talking about building with infrastructure. And I also want to thank NUNU and George and Nikki specifically today, Peg Ramir, Haley Dardar, and David Morrow, who are the team that